Opening the center dramatically increases the battle for central space and quickly activates attacking potential. Mirroring white's initial step, the game immediately enters symmetrical territory, setting the stage for a balanced struggle. Attacking the central pawn immediately, this knight aims to disrupt black's immediate pawn structure and prepare for further kingside development. Solidifying the pawn center, the knight boldly steps out, preparing for swift central development. Initiating the Lopez, white immediately targets black's knight, creating an imbalance and subtly influencing central pawn structure. Challenging the bishop's influence, this pawn push immediately questions white's central ambitions and prepares to gain queenside space. Preserving the bishop's diagonal control, white maintains pressure and keeps black's options constrained. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move challenges white's bishop and prepares for castling, asserting black's central influence. Safeguarding the king allows for more ambitious central play and prepares for potential pawn advances. Developing the bishop here prepares castling and aims for central influence without immediate confrontation. Preparing for a central pawn advance while securing the kingside rook, this maneuver subtly aims to contest the e-file and potentially create complications later. Expanding aggressively on the queenside aims to dislodge white's bishop and gain space, but it comes at the cost of creating pawn weaknesses that could be exploited later. Retreating the bishop to b3 preserves its influence on the long diagonal and prepares for potential pawn advances on the queenside, while also avoiding the immediate threat of the pawn. Solidifying the center and preparing to contest the open files emerges as black's clear objective, a sound positional statement after the gambit play. This advance also opens a diagonal for the dark-squared bishop and aims to address white's central control, potentially leading to a more balanced middle-game structure where pawn chains become crucial. Solidifying the d4 square while preparing a potential kingside pawn advance becomes paramount here. Securing the king in the cozy castle is a prudent step, anticipating potential future skirmishes on the kingside and solidifying the defensive structure. Securing the bishop's escape route from the g4-h5 diagonal prevents any immediate tactical threats that might arise from a misplaced dark-squared bishop, subtly reinforcing the king's safety while preparing for a potential kingside pawn push. Challenging the bishop's influence and aiming for a queenside expansion, this maneuver prepares to exchange off white's most actively placed piece and potentially open lines for black's pieces. It signals a strategic intention to contest the center from a distance while solidifying the kingside further. Relocating the bishop to a more active diagonal clears the way for the rook to potentially contest the e-file, while simultaneously preparing for a central pawn push, aiming to solidify white's piece placement and limit black's queenside expansion. A bold central thrust, 10. c5 immediately challenges white's kingside space and seeks to open lines for black's pieces, a strategic gamble aiming to disrupt white's comfortable setup and create dynamic counterplay. Striking at the center, white immediately challenges black's ambitious pawn chain and opens lines for their pieces, aiming to disrupt the harmonious development black has achieved. This aggressive central thrust forces black to confront the spatial pressure, potentially leading to a dynamic middle game where precise calculation will be paramount for both sides. Introducing the knight to d7, black seeks to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for a potential counterthrust with the d-pawn. This repositioning also aims to liberate the c8 bishop, which has been somewhat passively observing the game from its starting square, and potentially supports a future advance of the queenside pawns. It's a subtle shift, not an immediate aggressive action, but one that aims to create harmonious piece play and increase black's control over the d-file, all while keeping options open for challenging white's dominant central presence. Unlocking the d5 pawn's potential creates an immediate pawn chain, solidifying white's central control and limiting black's knight mobility, especially on the c6 square. This forward thrust signals a willingness to embrace a potentially cramped but structurally sound position, where white will seek to exploit the restricted space for black by developing pieces harmoniously and preparing for a queenside initiative while keeping a watchful eye on the potential weaknesses that might arise from the advanced pawn. The knight embarks on a journey to the queenside, aiming to reroute via c4 or d7 to bolster the central pawn chain, a tactical dance that simultaneously seeks to undermine white's central control and prepare for potential kingside expansion. The immediate creation of a pawn chain pushing forward aggressively, this maneuver seeks to gain crucial territory on the kingside, potentially cramping black's pieces and restricting their mobility, though it simultaneously weakens white's kingside pawn structure by creating potential holes. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, black boldly challenges white's aggressive pawn push, seeking to disrupt the attacking formation and potentially expose the white monarch to counterplay. Initiating a knight retreat to h2 is an interesting strategic gamble, aiming to reroute the knight towards the kingside or central squares, perhaps preparing for a future kingside attack or a repositioning to bolster the center. It concedes immediate kingside space to black's pawn storm and creates a potential light square weakness around white's king, but it avoids immediate confrontation and allows white to regroup their forces. The knight on h2 is currently passive, but its long-term purpose will be crucial to evaluating the success of this maneuver. Embracing the opening of the h-file with this capture instantly ignites the tactical fireworks, forcing white to address the sudden danger to their kingside. Opening the h-file offers a double-edged sword. While it creates immediate attacking chances against black's castled king, it also exposes white's own monarch. The pawn structure on the kingside is now permanently altered, potentially creating weaknesses for both sides to exploit later. This aggressive pawn push aims to disrupt black's defensive setup and seize the initiative, but it necessitates careful calculation to avoid counterplay. Unleashing the bishop's diagonal immediately challenges the pawn chain's integrity, aiming to disrupt white's centralized control by potentially opening lines towards the kingside. Initiating a retreat for the knight, this maneuver aims to redeploy it towards the kingside, potentially supporting a future g5 push or reinforcing the defense against black's queenside expansion. The pawn storm on the kingside, initiated by white's h3 and g4, has opened lines, and this knight repositioning might be a preparatory step to better control those newly formed diagonals and files, especially as black's bishop on g5 is quite active. It also offers some slight breathing room, avoiding immediate confrontation with black's more advanced pieces. Embracing the cramped position on the king's side, black aims to alleviate the pressure and potentially launch a counterattack along the newly opened g-file, but doing so weakens the kingside pawn structure, potentially creating targets for white's active pieces. White aims to consolidate the knight's position, eyeing the now weakened squares around black's castled king. This maneuver prepares for potential advances on the kingside, either directly or by supporting other pieces, while also ensuring the knight isn't trapped by black's queenside expansion. A bold exchange, sacrificing the bishop for immediate piece activity and potentially opening the h-file for white's rook. This decision immediately alters the positional landscape, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create counterplay where none seemed apparent just moments ago. Black is signaling a desire for dynamic imbalance, betting that the ensuing complications will favor their active pieces over white's more solid, yet potentially less dynamic, setup. It's a sharp gambit that forces white to calculate precisely, as any misstep could lead to a quick collapse of their central advantage. The queen's emergence from its defensive post now eyes the central tension, potentially aiming to exploit the weakened kingside structure black has allowed to develop. Preparing to unblock the kingside for potential counterplay. Sharpening the attack, white aims to pry open the kingside, preparing for a decisive breakthrough. Suddenly, the queen finds herself exposed on g5, and black's response immediately targets that vulnerability by repositioning the knight to b7, aiming to both defend the queen indirectly and prepare for potential queenside counterplay, perhaps by advancing the b-pawn or supporting a c-pawn push. This is a prudent defensive maneuver, recognizing the danger of white's advanced queen and seeking to stabilize the position before committing to further aggression. Initiating a queen exchange here signals a decisive shift towards a more open game, aiming to simplify the board and potentially exploit remaining imbalances, though it also liberates black's rook from its defensive duties. The rook's repositioning to the central file after the queen exchange immediately addresses the potential for central pawn breakthroughs and prepares for a more active role in the upcoming endgame, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that may arise on the open squares. Initiating pawn advances on the queenside aims to disrupt black's solid pawn structure and potentially open lines for white's remaining minor pieces, even if it comes at the cost of creating a potential weakness on b4 later. Opening that queenside file demands immediate attention, as it grants your rook an immediate pathway to the heart of white's position. Asserting control over the queenside chessboard is the primary objective here, aiming to cramp black's development and potentially create weaknesses. This recapture of the pawn, while seemingly straightforward, forces black to reevaluate their entire queenside structure, as the open a file now becomes a potential avenue for white's rooks to penetrate. Observe how the bishop now eyes the b5 square, restricting black's queenside pawn majority and limiting the mobility of the knight currently stationed on c6. This move subtly shifts the strategic balance, preparing for a more active presence in that sector of the board. The knight's desperate dive into the enemy camp, although capturing a pawn, significantly weakens black's queenside pawn structure and opens the file for white's rooks, potentially leading to a swift invasion. The rook reclaims the open file, a necessary repositioning after the pawn trade, but it leaves the 7th rank momentarily vulnerable to potential future infiltration by black's queen or minor pieces. Relinquishing the bishop pair to achieve a favorable pawn structure on the queenside feels like a strategic gamble, aiming to leverage the potential for queenside expansion and perhaps exploit any lingering weaknesses in white's king safety as the game transitions towards an endgame. Consolidating the rook on the 2nd rank, white aims to regain control of the now open file and prepare for potential future advances on the queenside, while simultaneously defending the pawn on a4 from any immediate pressure. Black boldly pushes forward, claiming vital central space and disrupting white's control of the d5 square, opening a path for the knight to potentially rejoin the battle on the kingside or support a future pawn advance. Reactivating the knight toward the queenside, nd2 aims to regain a foothold on that flank, particularly the vulnerable c4 pawn, while preparing to challenge black's space advantage and potentially reinforce the king's defenses. A bold maneuver, pushing the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to contest the c-file and potentially disrupt white's coordination in the queenside minor piece exchanges. The knight now embarks on a lengthy repositioning, a testament to the static nature of the queenside and white's desire to activate this piece where it can support pawn advances or potentially join in a kingside assault, hinting at a slow but deliberate build-up. Unleashing the rook from its defensive post on h8 injects immediate dynamism, creating a potential skewer threat against white's knight on f1 and aiming to activate the file for future incursions. Injecting a fresh injection of mobility, e3 aims to reposition the knight from its current less influential square, eyeing potential activation on f5 or even d5 if the central pawn structure shifts. This maneuver signifies white's intent to actively contest the queenside pawn majority black has cultivated, seeking to exploit any weaknesses that might arise as black endeavors to advance those pawns further. The knight's journey is less about immediate threats and more about subtle influence, a quiet preparation for a more dynamic phase of the game, perhaps aiming to disrupt black's carefully constructed pawn chain. Unleashing a sudden rush on the kingside, Rh4 immediately disrupts white's carefully constructed pawn shield and aims to exploit the open file, creating dynamic play. Proactively consolidating the king's safety, this maneuver seeks to reposition the monarch to a more secure square, away from the open lines and potential threats that have emerged on the queenside, while simultaneously preparing for a potential pawn advance or a strategic reshuffling of white's pieces to counter black's active rook. Reinforcing the central pawn chain by bringing the other rook into a more active position on the open file solidifies black's control over key squares and prepares for potential breakthroughs. Rethinking piece placement after the rook exchange, a subtle repositioning to fortify the kingside now, aiming to prevent further black incursions along the g-file and perhaps prepare a future regrouping for better central control or a kingside pawn push. The rook embarks on a daring central penetration, seeking to exploit the weakened dark squares around white's king and potentially create tactical opportunities on the h-file, a move that injects immediate dynamism into what was becoming a somewhat static position. Shifting the knight back to f1 offers flexibility, allowing it to redeploy to either e3 to support the central pawn push or g3 to bolster the kingside defense should the h-file become more active. Reactivating the knight on c5 injects immediate dynamism into black's queenside pressure. Reasserting central presence, white aims to displace the disruptive knight and solidify the pawn chain's integrity, preventing further incursions into the kingside. Developing the bishop to that active diagonal offers a new perspective on controlling the c4 square and prepares for potential advances on the queenside, subtly contesting the space white has meticulously carved out. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white seeks to break through black's pawn shield, hoping to pry open lines for attack and create opportunities against the isolated king. Unbalancing the position with pawn breaks, black gambits material for dynamic counterplay, aiming to pry open lines and disrupt white's rook on the file. Breaking open the f-file with the pawn sacrifice immediately creates winning attacking chances. It rips open the kingside cover that black had so carefully constructed, exposing the monarch to a devastating bombardment. The king, having escaped its castled fortress, now assumes a more active, albeit precarious, central role, a testament to the aggressive reshaping of the pawn structure. Reinforcing the rook's presence on the third rank, this maneuver seeks to create a more active pawn structure on the kingside, potentially preparing for a central pawn push or a shift of forces towards the queenside. The black king, abandoning its cozy castled position, now finds itself exposed to the central chaos white has meticulously manufactured. Challenging the center pawn's structural integrity, white aims to create new avenues for his pieces, potentially disrupting black's carefully constructed pawn chain. A dramatic check introduces immediate king activity, forcing white to confront a dangerous centralizing attack and potentially unraveling their pawn structure. King safety, paramount in any phase, is now a gaping wound on white's queenside. The monarch sidesteps into a more exposed central position, offering the rook on h3 an immediate and devastating penetration. Repositioning the bishop to b5 seeks to disrupt white's potentially advancing pawns on the queenside and create dynamic counterplay on the open f-file, while simultaneously challenging the stability of white's position after the series of pawn pushes. The rook relocates to the semi-open file, creating a new dimension of pressure along the first rank and threatening to infiltrate black's position should the knight on c5 falter. The rooks are being drawn into a surprisingly passive posture, a curious contrast to the earlier skirmish. This placement allows white to solidify their queenside presence and prepare for a potential advance on the file, limiting black's active counterplay. The king retreats once more, seemingly prioritizing safety over any active participation in the unfolding pawn struggle, a decision that might leave it feeling somewhat isolated as the pieces continue their dance across the board. The rook on f8 assumes a more active central position, eyeing potential pawn pushes and preparing to challenge the open file should it materialize. Repositioning the rook to the f-file aims to contest the open file and potentially disrupt black's looming kingside pressure, seeking to create counterplay before the knight on g3 becomes too exposed. Shifting the rook to the open b-file is a wise redirection, seeking to exploit the newly created space and apply pressure on white's queenside pawn structure, which is becoming somewhat isolated. The king, now exposed on the first rank after a series of pawn pushes and piece exchanges, presents a lingering vulnerability that white seems reluctant to address directly, prioritizing piece repositioning over immediate defensive reinforcement. A crucial repositioning aims to challenge the white rook's dominance on the file, seeking to open avenues for counterplay or even prepare a tactical surprise by activating the inactive rook. Opening the file with the rook immediately challenges black's pawn structure and creates opportunities for the white rook to penetrate the enemy position. The rook's repositioning to the c-file signals an attempt to disrupt white's current harmonious setup and potentially create future tactical complications, aiming to leverage the open lines that have developed. Securing the rook on the third rank aims to prevent black's bishop from finding any further active squares and to prepare for potential pawn advances on the king side, aiming to create weaknesses around the black monarch. Recognizing the futility of further advances on the queen side and sensing a potential shift in the balance of play, black aims to reposition their rook from its somewhat exposed post on the file to a more active central square, preparing for a possible regrouping of forces. The rook repositions, seeking a more active role on the fifth rank, aiming to support its pawns or potentially create threats on the queen side if black overextends. Shifting the rook to the seventh rank now aims to challenge white's control of that crucial pathway, seeking to disrupt any immediate plans of white's pieces, consolidating on those squares, and potentially setting up a future attack on the king side if opportunities arise. The king sidesteps again, a recurring theme, prioritizing safety amidst the encroaching black pressure on the queen side. Re-establishing presence on the seventh rank, the knight aims to disrupt white's entrenched defensive setup and create new attacking avenues. Consolidating forces around the queen's rook on a file that offers no immediate prospects is illogical, if somewhat passive, repositioning to prepare for future maneuvers or to simply prevent black from exploiting the open file further. Pushing the pawn to a5 initiates a crucial pawn race on the queen side, aiming to create a passed pawn and potentially open lines for the rook and bishop. The knight's repositioning to f1, a seemingly passive square, now aims to pivot through g3 and potentially bolster the king's defense or facilitate a regrouping of pieces on the queen side. The knight makes a daring foray, eyeing the vulnerable c3 square and aiming to disrupt white's rook on a1. The knight's repositioning to e3 is a fascinating attempt to create new attacking avenues while simultaneously reinforcing the king side, hinting at a potential regrouping for a later assault or a strategic pivot. Black seeks to exploit the queen side's openness by pushing the pawn, aiming to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's coordination. Unleashing the rook on the h-file disrupts black's carefully constructed defensive pawn chain, aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonal for the white queen and potentially create attacking chances against the black king. The rook now abandons its lonely outpost on the king side and heads towards the center, seeking active participation. The king, now liberated from the pawn shield, ventures into the arena, aiming to solidify its position on the dark squares of the queen side, potentially orchestrating a defensive maneuver or even preparing for an eventual advance into enemy territory. Reactivating the knight to d3 injects a fresh threat into the otherwise stagnant queen side, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps exploit the g-pawn's exposed position. Unlocking the d-file for the rook with this repositioning is a keen observation of the board's potential, aiming to stir activity where the opponent's king has recently found some shelter. Spotting a tactic that opens a pathway for the king and potentially disrupts white's setup is a sharp approach. Unleashing the king into the fray is a bold gamble, potentially opening new attacking avenues, but also exposing the monarch to unforeseen dangers in this complex endgame. The knight's repositioning to d3 opens up a fascinating tactical geometry, directly threatening the white king's immediate safety and forcing a critical decision regarding its escape routes. Striking the knight on c4 suddenly unlocks a significant material advantage, fundamentally altering the endgame's complexion. Unleashing the rook to the open file, black aims to disrupt white's slightly passive pawn structure and challenge the centralized knight, creating immediate tactical possibilities and forcing white to react decisively. Seizing the opportunity to disrupt black's active rook and open up the queen side, this advance is a crucial attempt to prevent further piece infiltration and gain some breathing room. Harnessing the open file, the rook aggressively repositions to eye the knight's exposed support structure. Unblocking the diagonal for the rook and bringing the knight into a more active central position, aiming to contest the d-file, are the immediate goals. Exploring the advanced squares presents a compelling opportunity for black to disrupt white's coordinated pieces and potentially force exchanges that simplify the position. Unlocking a critical escape route for the white king becomes paramount, as black's advanced pawns threaten to restrict white's mobility. The knight, now untroubled on its central outpost, begins a patient creep towards the queenside, aiming to exploit the weaker pawn and potentially infiltrate white's defenses. Opening up the queenside to unleash the knight's potential. The knight's relocation to B3 aims to disrupt white's queenside structure, threatening to pierce into the weakened C4 pawn and potentially infiltrate deeper into white's territory, creating significant positional headaches. Navigating this pawn-rich territory, white reinforces the outpost while creating a potential backdoor entry for the knight. The bishop retreats to its most active diagonal, preparing to exert pressure on white's queenside pawns and potentially infiltrate on the file if the opportunity arises. Seeking refuge from the biting knight on D3, the white king retreats to its prior square, hoping to consolidate a defense against black's relentless pressure and prepare for the inevitable pawn thrusts. Unlocking the bishop's potential from its passive post behind the pawns, preparing a more active role in the ensuing pawn storm. Securing the knight's advance to a more active square, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's defensive setup and prepare for potential breakthroughs. Sharpening the attack on white's D3 pawn creates immediate pressure and forces a reactive response. Seizing the open E file with the knight offers an immediate avenue for counterplay, potentially disrupting black's coordinated pieces and creating tactical possibilities. The bishop's journey to the rim, though seemingly passive, aims to redeploy to a more active diagonal, perhaps to contest the open file or to support potential pawn advances down the queenside, keeping options open in a tense, maneuvering battle. Pushing the c-pawn opens critical lines for your pieces and aims to disrupt black's compact setup, potentially creating weaknesses on the queenside and giving your knight a clearer path to attack. Seeking to establish a more dynamic pawn structure and perhaps disrupt white's queenside space advantage, black repositions the rook, aiming to reinforce the b-pawn and maintain flexibility for future maneuvers, though it relinquishes some immediate pressure on the queenside. This pawn thrust aims to dislodge black's knight from its outpost, potentially opening lines for white's rooks or creating space for further advancement, though it also exposes the b-pawn to immediate attack. Shifting the knight to c5 offers a dynamic pivot, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create advanced outposts, but it also leaves a potentially vulnerable square on d7 exposed for future black advances. Initiating a repositioning of the knight to a more centralized square promises to increase its influence over the board's core. The king ventures out, seeking respite on d8, a daring maneuver aimed at activating its presence and potentially contesting central control amidst the sprawling pawns. Opening the path for the knight to a more active outpost signals a shift in strategic focus, aiming to dismantle black's defensive setup and exploit the weakened queenside pawns. The rook repositions, seeking a more active role on the open file, potentially aiming to disrupt white's knight's outpost or create mating threats against the king. Gaining a foothold in the cramped position by centralizing the knight, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pawn structure and perhaps prepare for a future kingside advance. Relocating the king to the central files might offer some protection from the roving knights, aiming to build a defensive stronghold away from the immediate threats. A bold repositioning of the knight, aiming to pierce the black kingside and create imbalances. The knight's sudden repositioning to b6, abandoning the central control it held for so long, signals an intention to support a pawn advance on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn or at least disrupt white's structure. Pushing the knight to f7 aims to pry open the b-file for potential infiltration, and simultaneously prepares to challenge the strong black knight on c5, offering a dynamic exchange that could destabilize black's pawn structure. The rooks are finally getting active, attempting to exploit the newly opened diagonals created by black's aggressive pawn pushes. The rook's redeployment to the second rank prepares to contest the vital f-file, aiming to either restrict black's recently activated knight or create avenues for white's own pieces to penetrate. The defender, sensing an opportunity to create a passed pawn, pushes the a-pawn forward, aiming to disrupt white's well-placed knights and perhaps force a concession on the queen side. The knight now faces a challenging repositioning, as the rook on f3 attempts to dislodge the bothersome knight from its advanced post. Bringing the bishop into active play after maneuvering it to the queenside aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create tactical opportunities, potentially targeting the weak squares that have emerged. Consolidating the rook's defensive position, this allows the knight to prepare a potential foray into black's vulnerable queenside structure. The unleashed pawn now marches forward, threatening to disrupt white's entire queenside structure and forcing a critical decision about how to contain its advance. Snatching the knight opens a path for the rook to control the now abandoned file, creating immediate threats against black's exposed king. Seizing the opportunity presented by the overloaded knight, black snatches a pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and inject chaos into the position before the material disparity becomes overwhelming. Reactivating the rook to the open file seizes a vital pathway, preparing for a potential advance that could destabilize black's pawn structure and challenge its defensive coordination. Introducing a new attacker to the vulnerable white king's periphery with the bishop provides a crucial shift in pressure, potentially forcing concessions or creating new exploitable weaknesses. Sacrificing the pawn to open the diagonal for the queen offers a dynamic counterplay, aiming to disrupt black's pawns and create immediate threats. Embracing the inevitable, black opens a critical diagonal, aiming to activate the bishop and contest the central squares, a necessary gamble given the impending pawn push.